It's going to happen again. The TCG card world is littered with dozens and dozens of failed attempts to get TCG card games off the ground, and they failed for numerous reasons over the years. And here, as we go into 2024, some of the favorite TCG card games are likely not going to survive, and in today's video we are going to discuss what happened in the past so you can prepare yourself for the future. Honestly, none of this should come as a surprise to anyone who is struggling out there in the real world. Welcome back everyone, MTG Moxman here, and thanks again for hanging out with me on my channel today. A reminder that if you enjoyed today's content, don't forget, like and subscribe to the channel, turn on your notification bells, new content every single day. And today we're talking about failed TCG games and the fact that more often than not, TCG games fail in environments just like we're going through right now. There's only so many dollars available for hobbies. And players who already have established hobbies are less likely to pour their cash and resources into new hobbies that they're just starting to get into. So what does that mean? Well, this isn't the first time we've gone through this. When Wizards of the Coast was a brand new company, not part of Hasbro, and just a fledgling beginning TCG card company, they put out their game and it really started to get traction. But when it started to gain steam, when players started to realize how fantastic this game was, so did other companies, and they tried to imitate it using their own IP to try to make their game be better than the fledgling Wizards of the Coast, but they all failed. They may have failed later, they may have failed sooner, but in the end, the only one really left standing was, of course, Magic the Gathering. Now, people are going to argue later on, of course, we have Pokemon, and there are other games that are still standing strong nowadays, like Yu-Gi-Oh!, Pokemon, I think even Digimon, and a few other games are still out there. Yes, we have Flesh and Blood, and we know what's happening with MetaZoo, but that's why we're here discussing this, because there's only so many dollars that people have right now to spare on a hobby. And when you've got 7 or 8 mini hobbies going, you're going to start cutting off the ones you don't care about as much. And that usually means a fledgling new game that needs cash streams, that needs revenue coming in to keep creating and expanding, tends to fail. Now, older TCGs failed for a whole litany of reasons, from not being able to organize gameplay, to overprinting, to even just idiotic ideas within the company that led to their failure. Regardless of the reasons, this is all happening again, because here in 2024, it's going to get tight. We're right at the end of 2023, and I can tell you from looking at the sales figures from over 50 stores now, it's looking pretty bad for a lot of these new TCG games. They're not going to get the cash they need to continue operating, which means they're probably going to become defunct. Be aware of this. It may not happen right away. It may be a slow, grimy death, but chances are we're going to get that way. So first off, I want to show you guys a couple of old TCG games that failed. These games may have been loved and played by me and many other people in the 90s, maybe even into the early 2000s, but in the end, they all failed to make it the long term, which is why games like Pokemon, Wizards of the Coast, Magic the Gathering are the longest standing games out there. They keep reinventing themselves and keep being creative where other games just couldn't compete. Now, the first game I want to share with you guys here is Overpower. This came out in 1995. It's only a couple of years after Magic. They saw what they were doing and they ramped this up. I believe this was produced by Fleer originally, and then I think Marvel Interactive took it over at some point in like 98 or 99. And then, of course, eventually it went to Wizards of the Coast to do a card game based on Marvel characters. Of course, that only went till 2001, and before you knew it, it was done, okay? They couldn't keep things going. They tried other things in like 2009, I think, with X-Men. The game failed. It went for a long time. Fans tried to keep this game going. It had expansions. It did other things. It wasn't enough to keep things going. I remember fondly playing this game, but in the end, it still didn't have the staying power necessary. It didn't have the value, it didn't have the collectability, and of course the print runs were massive even by back then standards, because packs were only a couple of bucks. It was pretty cheap to play this game, and it just didn't have the value backing it to make players desire certain cards, and all the cards were pretty easy to get, honestly. So at the end of Overpower, A Marvel game produced by Wizards of the Coast. And now in 2024, we're about to get a Universes Beyond Marvel game of Magic. I wonder if those old contracts are still in effect. It kind of gives you pause to think about it, doesn't it? But they're not the only games out there. Overpower was not the only game that was rushed out, had initial success, and then started to fail over time when players became a little more choosy and tougher times came around, which is what happened around 95. It became a lot tougher for people to have cash flow. Now you think about this with games we have nowadays like Flesh and Blood, MetaZoo, other upcoming TCG games like Sorcery, Lorcana. It's funny to see how many of these games are actually going to survive versus how many are just cash flow. Let's take a look at another TCG that I played as a kid that also failed. Now our next game here is Wyvern. It was a 2-player game. I remember playing it. You had a couple of decks and you got to like go against each other. Games were pretty simplistic as I recall. You began with like 6 face-down dragon and terrain cards. You had like a battlefield, right? Then you had these like gold painted pieces, guys. It was a really fun game. And sometimes the games went really long, but again, it didn't have the staying power necessary. I mean, if you wanted to, you could find this thing right now on eBay for like $250 for like a sealed box of this game, okay? That's how it is nowadays. These dead TCGs are still highly sought after playable games, but they command no secondary market value because they couldn't stay the test of time. They didn't make it 20, 30 years, did they? They ended. This game went from like 95 to 97 and it didn't go any further, and that's just the death of a game. Now, when we're talking about other games like this one here is the Illuminati, okay? This game was like a Steve Jackson based on some book in 1975. I remember this whole world domination thing. You had all these different win scenarios, nuclear bombs and stuff. I remember playing it, and right now, you can go on eBay. You can buy a whole slew of these cards for a couple $100, and basically you'd have games you could play for the next 10 years. Okay, dead TCGs don't make them any less playable or any less creative than new games. They already exist. The rules are well thought out and planned, but the game never got the attention, never got the attraction, didn't have the staying power, couldn't expand where they needed to keep these games going. And I want you guys to think about stuff here. When you look here, here's Jihad. This is like the vampire, the eternal struggle, okay? I think this is also taken over by Wizards of the Coast, but here, you can buy sealed boxes, starter decks, for $250, okay? When you look at any new card game out there now, you look at Sorcery, you guys go ahead and you take a look at Lorcana, and you ask me this, where do you see those games in 5 years or 10 years? Where do you see them? Because most TCGs bite the dust. And for all the people out there, for all these players out there, speculating in this market and believing these cards have long-term value, there's a reason why Pokemon and Magic are still around. There is reasons. And as hard fought as it is to hate Wizards of the Coast or hate Pokemon or hate what they represent, the staying power of those games usually draws players back over the long term. Players come and go over and over again in their lifetime, where the other TCGs I'm showing you are dead and gone. Now let's talk about something even scarier. You see Flesh and Blood on my screen here? You see MetaZoo? I didn't put Sorcery or Lorcana. I couldn't get enough sales data to really let you guys know. MetaZoo is next to 0 sales at every store I checked. 0. With a lot of players trying to cash in their stuff and try to get some kind of value out of it. Flesh and Blood, guess how much the sales are? Yeah, you guessed it. It's next to 0. Nothing selling at all. Not singles, not boxes. The sales are so low, it's not even really worth mentioning in the video, other than to say, I'm not saying the games are going to die. I'm saying over the long term, with the economy the way it is, games like this are going to take a back seat to what players already know or already have a lot of cash into. Other hobbies. If you're playing Warhammer 40k, you're playing Flesh and Blood, and you're playing Magic, and you got to ditch them. Well, the ones you play the most are the ones you're going to keep, and the new one, the one that's going to be ditched, which means those new TCG games don't get the cash flow necessary to keep new things coming, to keep the brand evolving. And that means they die. They become defunct. They get bought out. At least their IP and label and proprietary stuff gets bought up, and it gets used by another company like Wizards of the Coast, eating and feasting as a vulture off a corpse. It may not happen right away, but as I'm talking about in this video today, guys, the TCG world is just littered with games like Spellfire. These are games that are now owned by Wizards of the Coast, but back then, Wizards of the Coast hadn't bought TSR. And by the way, TSR is Dungeons and Dragons, for those who didn't know. TSR is what I knew growing up. It was Dungeons and Dragons, but Wizards of the Coast got so much money that they bought up and absorbed D&D. But before that, Dungeons and Dragons tried to put out their own game. They put out Spellfire, and it didn't last. It went for a while, honestly. We had all kinds of expansions into Forgotten Realms. We had expansions into even Dragonlance and Ravenloft, and it didn't hold up. And now they own it all. They can do what they want with it. Wizards of the Coast is the one that's standing. They've got the IP. They've got the licenses. And you guys have to understand, by controlling those licenses, they can do a multitude of things, from branding, rebranding. They can issue Transformers. They can issue GoBots because they own all the rights. They can put out retro Star Wars figures as Kenner because they own the Kenner license. Don't forget what companies like this can do. And because they're already established and have a long history, that's what's going to happen. To the TCG you may love, you may still play it, you may still enjoy it, you may make fan-made cards. Just like the Transformers game from Hasbro got killed off during COVID due to low sales volumes, many of these other games like MetaZoo, like Flesh and Blood, Sorcery, Lorcana, they are not going to stick the test of time. Remember, they've tried this before. We've seen it happen before. History repeats itself. We're not reinventing the wheel. It just goes around and around. People try the same thing, and the odd time they really think they're going to make it, and maybe they do. I hope some of these companies can stick it around long enough to get through this hump, but I'll tell you right now, it looks abysmal. It looks really bad. And there's nothing any of us, it's not our fault or the company's fault. It's just the way the world works sometimes. Doesn't mean you can't go back and enjoy the game 10 years from now, because it's going to be a dead TCG. It's going to be available on eBay, and it's going to be pretty darn cheap considering how old the game is. And you're going to be able to get sealed product at a dirt cheap price. Guys, thanks a lot for hanging out today. Thanks for being with me on the video. I would love to hear your comments about what you see out there. Let me know how sales and stuff are going wherever you are in the world. I'd like to know. Add those comments to the comments section. I look forward to seeing you guys tomorrow. Oh, we've got the top 10 this weekend. The Saturday top 10 for all the modern and new cards. And of course, the reserve list top 10 is going to be on Sunday. And the modern one, of course, is on Saturday. And the live stream is going to be Saturday. And that would be 6:30 Eastern Standard Time, because Sunday is New Year's Eve. And I'll be out with Mrs. Mox and Mini Mox. Okay, guys? Thanks again for hanging out. Have a great day. Don't forget to bring a friend to Magic. And of course, guys, a big shout out and thank you to the fantastic patrons of the channel. Thanks again for that support you show each and every day. If you want to be a patron, you can try to find me on my Patreon. There might be slots available. Or, of course, you can join the YouTube membership member. Have a great one, everyone. Well, here we are. Welcome back to the Ramble Jamble. We are on location. You know it's true. Extra time up here at the other property, so I'll be filming up here the next couple of days. So let's talk about this, guys. You're here at the Ramble Jamble. You've made it this far. You want to hear what I'm really thinking. And honestly, the video pretty summed it up pretty well for me. But the idea is, when you have speculators ducking out, which means they're not putting their hard-earned cash to fuel the economy of these cards to get hype going, when it's just the game standing alone, a lot of them are going to fail. We've seen it before. I knew guys who tried to, teenagers and stuff who would buy a whole bunch of Overpower, but it just kept getting restocked. They buy Spelljammer, but it was, $1.50 a pack. It was just so readily available with no constrictions, no collectability to it, that it failed. So although Wizards is messing up right now and they're having a hard time, imagine how other companies are going through the exact same thing. Those other companies are struggling 10 times harder than what we're seeing Hasbro go through. And Hasbro cuts off its own limbs. When the TCG for Transformers didn't pan out the way they wanted to, they cut it off. Instead of trying to nurture a small ember, they just chopped it off at the legs and said it's dead, it's done. And that's sad, because a lot of people I knew really enjoyed that game. And all these other TCGs you see in the background, which I had a lot of fun putting together. And you see MetaZoo with the sales so low, Flesh and Blood not doing well. And yes, it could be doing good in certain areas. Don't get me wrong. I'm sure I'm going to get flack on that. Okay? But I'm telling you, the sales volumes that I can record and look at and visually see are next to zero. Some of the stores don't even want me to tell you this, but they agreed to, just because they're not restocking it. So it's not going to hurt them anyway. That's how it's going. The bigger stores that have a lot of these cards available, they don't give me that kind of sales data. Okay? Very rarely do I get to see the actual sheets to see how much they're ordering or how much is actually selling. Sometimes I get an inkling from them or a wink, wink, nudge, nudge. And in this case, a lot of these stores were just saying the sales are really bad. Way worse than we expected. Didn't help with the holiday season. We're not doing much about it. A lot of these TCGs are not going to survive because whoever created them has already gotten their cash out now. They did the initial run, they make their money, and they get out. They don't care if it dies 4 or 5 years from now. They've milked the players for as much as they can get, which is why there's so many dead TCGs sitting out there in the multiverse of eBay that you can just pick up. $250. I don't have to buy a box of sorcery. I can buy a 30-year-old box of Jihad, the Eternal Struggle. I can play just like I did in high school. I can get 12 starter decks for $250 and play. Crazy, right? I can go back and get booster boxes of Spelljammer Ravenloft for $112. Kind of scary, isn't it? But this is what it comes to when a TCG dies. It doesn't make it less playable. It just means there's no support beyond the initial run of the game. Crazy stuff, guys. Anyway, thanks for hanging out. This is what happens, and I see it happening. I'm not going to say it's going to all crash down tomorrow, but you wait like the next 5 years, we'll see who's left standing. It's going to be very interesting. So thanks a lot. Thanks for hanging out. Enjoy the day. Chill out. I'm looking forward to seeing you guys all this weekend. We're going to have a great time. I have some great videos lined up. The top 10 reserve list is going to blow your flipping mind.